The rope that held the rope stretched tight across the void, disappearing into the darkness below Hacksaw Ridge as another mortar round shook loose coral fragments from the cliff face. Desmond Doss tested the line one more time, his raw palms burning against the hemp fibers that had already carried 15 men to safety. The voices calling from the darkness behind him had grown weaker through the night, but they hadn't stopped. "Medic, over here!" The April rain had turned the top of the ridge into a slippery maze of shell holes and shattered coral, each crater potentially hiding wounded Americans or concealed Japanese positions. What remained of the 77th Infantry Division's assault companies had pulled back hours ago, leaving behind equipment, weapons, and men too broken to follow the retreat order. The original plan had called for a coordinated dawn attack to clear Japanese positions from the plateau, but the enemy's network of caves and tunnels had turned the morning into a slaughter. Doss crouched behind what had once been a large coral outcropping, now reduced to rubble by repeated artillery strikes. His medical kit lay empty beside him, every bandage and morphine syringe exhausted hours earlier. He'd been forced to improvise tourniquets from bootlaces and rifle slings, wadding torn fabric from uniforms against wounds that needed surgical attention he couldn't provide. The rope, his only connection to the medical teams waiting below, had become everything. Lifeline, anchor point, and the thin strand that separated 19 families from telegrams they didn't want to receive. Through the rain and intermittent gunfire, he could hear movement in the Japanese positions. They knew someone was still moving on the American side of the ridge, but the darkness and broken terrain made accurate fire impossible. Occasionally, a machine gun would chatter across the plateau, sending tracers through the night like angry fireflies. But most of the enemy fire seemed random, designed more to discourage movement than to hit specific targets. Private Morrison lay 30 yards away, barely conscious from blood loss and shock. The boy had been calling for his mother when Doss reached him, clutching a photograph with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Morrison was heavy, dead weight that would test the rope's fraying fibers, but Doss had made a promise to himself hours ago. One more. Always one more. The cliff edge offered no shelter from the wind that carried the scent of smoke and rain across the ridge. Each time Doss approached the drop, he felt the familiar knot in his stomach, not fear of heights, but fear that this time the rope would snap, sending another wounded man to his death on the coral below. The anchor point, a sturdy tree stump, showed stress fractures where the constant strain had begun to split the wood. Behind him, Sergeant Crawford's voice cut through the darkness. Crawford had been hit early in the morning assault, his shoulder torn by shrapnel, but he'd remained conscious and alert throughout the long hours since the retreat order. "Doss, you can't keep this up. That rope won't hold much longer." "It's held so far," Doss replied quietly, checking Morrison's makeshift bandages. The boy's pulse was weak but steady. "Just need it to hold a little longer." What Crawford didn't say, what none of the wounded said, was that they'd all heard the stories about Doss during training. The medic who wouldn't carry a rifle, who'd faced disciplinary action rather than compromise his beliefs, who'd somehow convinced the brass to let him serve without a weapon. Some had questioned whether he'd be useful in combat. Others had worried he'd get them killed. Now, as Morrison's weight settled against the rope and Doss began the careful hand-over-hand descent, Crawford watched the line stretch and groan under the load. The medic moved with methodical precision, testing each grip, pausing when the fibers showed signs of separating. Below, lights flickered where medical teams waited to receive whatever casualties came down from the ridge that the morning's assault had turned into a death trap. The rope held. It always held, though Doss couldn't explain why except to whisper the same prayer he'd been repeating since sunset. "Lord, help me get one more. Help me get one more." When Morrison reached bottom safely, spontaneous cheers erupted from the medical teams below. Doss pulled the rope back up, examining the new wear patterns where Morrison's weight had stressed the line. 3 more men remained scattered across the ridge, their voices growing fainter as exhaustion and blood loss took their toll. The rain continued to fall on Hacksaw Ridge, turning the coral dust into slippery mud that made every step treacherous. Somewhere in the darkness, Japanese soldiers waited in their caves and tunnels, as committed to holding their ground as Doss was to clearing his. Between them lay the fundamental question that would define the next few hours. How many times could faith and physics intersect before one or both gave way? If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The Japanese positions erupted in sudden machine gun fire as Doss crawled toward the next wounded man, forcing him to press flat against the muddy coral while bullets sparked off rocks inches from his head. The enemy had been tracking his movement pattern, waiting for him to expose himself in the open ground between shell craters. This time, they'd nearly caught him. Corporal Jenkins lay unconscious in a depression 40 yards from the cliff edge, his breathing shallow and irregular. Jenkins was one of the soldiers who'd openly questioned Doss's usefulness during training, asking loudly why the army would send an unarmed man into combat zones. "What good's a medic who won't shoot back?" he demanded during a particularly heated discussion in the barracks. Now Jenkins needed that same medic to carry him across exposed ground while enemy observers called in mortar strikes on their position. The Okinawa campaign had prepared none of them for the reality of Hacksaw Ridge. Intelligence reports had mentioned caves and defensive positions, but the briefings hadn't conveyed the claustrophobic terror of fighting an invisible enemy who could appear from hidden tunnels, strike, and disappear back underground. The 77th Infantry Division had expected a conventional assault against prepared positions. Instead, they'd walked into a three-dimensional maze where the enemy controlled every sight line and escape route. Doss waited for the machine gun fire to shift toward another sector, then sprinted across the open ground in a low crouch. He reached Jenkins just as mortar rounds began falling closer to their position, sending up geysers of coral fragments and mud. The corporal's uniform was soaked with rainwater and blood, his pulse barely detectable. "Jenkins," Doss whispered, checking for wounds. "Can you hear me?" The corporal's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Doss, you're still here?" His voice was barely audible over the distant gunfire. "Everyone else pulled back hours ago." "Not everyone," Doss replied, fashioning a new bandage from torn fabric. "We're going to get you down from here." Jenkins tried to shake his head, wincing at the movement. "Too heavy. Rope won't hold. Leave me." But Doss had already begun the difficult process of moving an unconscious man across broken terrain under enemy observation. Jenkins was indeed heavy, his dead weight making every yard a struggle against gravity and exhaustion. The route to the cliff edge required crossing two open areas where Japanese gunners could observe movement, timing their dash between lulls in the sporadic fire. Halfway to the rope, Jenkins regained consciousness long enough to grab Doss's arm. "Why?" he gasped. "After everything I said about you, why risk this?" Doss paused, listening to distant voices calling from other positions on the ridge. "Same reason you would," he said finally. "It's what we signed up for." The rope showed new stress patterns when they reached the cliff edge, several strands beginning to separate near the anchor point. Doss tested the line carefully, knowing that Jenkins's weight would push the hemp fibers closer to their breaking point. Below, medical teams waited with stretchers and plasma bottles, having learned to maintain constant readiness for casualties descending from the ridge at all hours. The descent took longer than any previous rescue. Jenkins's unconscious weight made controlling the lowering speed nearly impossible, and twice Doss had to stop when the rope stretched ominously, fibers popping with small snapping sounds that echoed off the cliff face. His hands, already raw from previous rescues, began bleeding as he gripped the line harder to maintain control. Dr. Patterson, working in the aid station below the ridge, had stopped counting casualties after the 10th man descended from the darkness above. "How many more?" he asked his orderly, preparing another stretcher as Jenkins reached safety. Still voices calling up there, Doc. That medic's still moving around. Patterson shook his head, checking Jenkins's vital signs. One man with no weapon, moving around a ridge that two companies couldn't hold in daylight. Doesn't make tactical sense. But tactical sense had little to do with what drove Doss back to the rope for another ascent. As he climbed hand over hand through the rain, he could hear two more voices calling from different positions on the ridge. Private Williams had been hit in both legs during the morning's retreat, unable to crawl to safety. Lieutenant Murphy, the youngest officer in the company, had taken shrapnel in his back and couldn't move without assistance. The rope groaned under Doss's weight as he pulled himself back onto the ridge, testing each grip point where repeated use had worn the fibers thin. The anchor point, that crucial tree stump, showed new cracks from the constant strain, but it continued to hold despite the punishment. Japanese mortar fire had intensified, suggesting that enemy observers had identified the rope as a key evacuation route. Several rounds had fallen close enough to the cliff edge to shower the area with coral fragments, but none had scored a direct hit on the anchor point or the lowering route. As Doss moved toward Williams's position, he noticed something that made him pause. Absolute silence from the direction where Murphy had been calling. In combat, silence often meant the worst, but it could also indicate unconsciousness or simply exhaustion. Either way, it added urgency to a situation already measured in minutes rather than hours. The rain continued to fall across Hacksaw Ridge, washing mud and coral dust down the cliff face, where it mixed with equipment abandoned during the morning's failed assault. Somewhere in the darkness, 3 wounded Americans waited for rescue, while Japanese soldiers maintained their vigilant defense of positions they'd turned into an underground fortress. The rope snapped. Not completely. 3 strands held while the others whipped loose in the wind, but enough to send Private Williams plummeting the last 10 feet to the rocky ledge where medical teams waited with stretchers. Williams hit hard, his injured legs absorbing an impact that would leave him walking with a limp for the rest of his life, but he was alive. Doss stared down at the damaged rope, calculating odds he didn't want to face. The remaining strands might support 1 more descent, possibly 2, if the men were light enough, but each use brought the line closer to complete failure. Above him on the ridge, Lieutenant Murphy had begun calling again, delirious, pain-filled cries that carried clearly through the rain-soaked darkness. "The rope's finished," Sergeant Crawford observed from his position near the cliff edge. His shoulder wound had stiffened during the long night, leaving his right arm nearly useless, but his mind remained sharp. "Even if we splice those loose ends back together, it won't hold combat weight." The 77th Infantry Division's after-action reports would later describe the evacuation of wounded from Hacksaw Ridge as successful despite challenging conditions. The clinical language would fail to capture the reality of decisions made in darkness, with enemy fire constraining every movement and equipment, failing under stresses no manual had anticipated. Doss examined the rope's anchor point, looking for alternative rigging options. The tree stump showed stress fractures from repeated loading, but a second anchor point, a coral outcropping 15 feet from the original, might distribute the weight differently. Rigging a new line would require cannibalizing equipment from abandoned positions on the ridge, splicing sections of rope found among scattered gear. "Murphy's hurt bad," Crawford continued, listening to the lieutenant's increasingly incoherent calls. "Spinal injury from the sound of it. Moving him wrong could paralyze him permanently." The moral calculus was brutal: attempt a rescue using unreliable equipment that might kill Murphy during the descent, or leave him on the ridge where Japanese mortars would eventually find their mark. Standard medical protocol called for stabilizing spinal injuries before transport, but stabilization required equipment and time Doss didn't have. Below the ridge, Dr. Patterson worked frantically to stabilize Williams, whose impact with the ledge had reopened wounds that had finally stopped bleeding. "How many more coming down?" he called up toward the darkness, not expecting an answer from the medical teams positioned near the cliff base. Rope's damaged, Doc. Might not be any more tonight. Patterson paused in his work, considering the implications. 17 men had been lowered from the ridge over the course of the night, each one arriving battered but alive. The mathematics of combat medicine suggested that at least 5 or 6 wounded soldiers remained unaccounted for from the morning's failed assault. If the rope had failed completely, those men would die on the ridge, while rescue teams waited helplessly below. Doss found what he needed scattered among abandoned American positions, sections of communication wire, rifle slings, and pieces of rope from equipment packs. None of it was rated for human loads, but spliced together and rigged through multiple anchor points, it might support one careful descent. The improvised system would be slower, requiring constant testing and adjustment, but it offered the only chance of reaching Murphy before shock and exposure finished what enemy shrapnel had started. The work required exposing himself to enemy observation while moving between scattered equipment caches. Japanese gunners had learned to anticipate movement on the American side of the ridge, laying down harassing fire whenever shadows moved against the coral outcroppings. Twice, Doss had to freeze in place while machine gun bursts searched the area where he'd been working. Murphy's calls had changed character, becoming weaker but more coherent as shock deepened. "Can anyone hear me? I can't feel my legs. Someone please!" The improvised rope system took shape slowly, each splice and anchor point tested under Doss's own weight before being declared ready for use. The new configuration distributed loads across 3 anchor points instead of 1, reducing stress on individual components but complicating the descent procedure. Lowering Murphy would require careful coordination and constant adjustment of tension on multiple lines. Crawford watched the rigging process with professional interest, recognizing both its ingenuity and its limitations. "That setup might work once," he observed. "Maybe twice, if we're careful, but it's not going to last the night." Doss nodded, understanding the implications. If other wounded men remained scattered across the ridge, men too badly hurt to call out or unconscious in hidden positions, this improvised system represented their only chance of rescue. After Murphy, every decision would carry the weight of choosing between known casualties and potential casualties, between the certain and the possible. The rain intensified as Doss prepared for what might be his final descent from Hacksaw Ridge. Murphy's position lay in the most exposed section of the plateau, requiring a dangerous crawl across open ground where Japanese observers had clear sight lines. Reaching him would be difficult. Getting him back to the cliff edge might be impossible. But the improvised rope held steady under testing, and Murphy's voice carried clearly through the darkness, providing a clear target for rescue efforts. As Doss began moving toward the wounded lieutenant, he whispered the prayer that had sustained him through the long night. "Lord, help me get one more, just one more." Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Lieutenant Murphy weighed barely 140 pounds, but moving him across 50 yards of broken terrain felt like dragging dead weight through quicksand. The spinal injury had left him paralyzed from the waist down, unable to assist with his own rescue, and every movement risked causing permanent damage to nerves already traumatized by shrapnel. Doss had found Murphy wedged in a shell crater that had filled partially with rainwater, his uniform soaked through and his body temperature dropping toward dangerous levels. The lieutenant drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to whisper instructions about other wounded men, sometimes calling for his mother or reciting fragments of prayers from childhood. "There's something you need to know," Murphy gasped during a moment of clarity as Doss checked his improvised bandages. "About the morning assault, about what really happened up here." The Japanese had been waiting. Not just positioned defensively, but actively tracking American troop movements and coordinating their response with intelligence gathered over several days. The caves and tunnels that honeycombed Hacksaw Ridge weren't random defensive positions. They formed an integrated network that allowed enemy forces to mass quickly at threatened points while remaining invisible to American observers. "They knew we were coming," Murphy continued, his voice barely audible over distant mortar fire. "They knew our approach routes, our timing, everything. Someone told them." Doss absorbed this information while testing the improvised rope system one final time. If Murphy was right, if the morning's assault had walked into a prepared ambush rather than encountering unexpected resistance, it explained the devastating casualty rate and the speed with which American forces had been forced to retreat. It also meant that future assaults on Hacksaw Ridge would face similar challenges unless intelligence gaps could be identified and closed. The descent began just after midnight, with Murphy strapped to an improvised stretcher fashioned from rifle stocks and torn shelter halves. The new rope configuration required Doss to control 3 separate lines simultaneously, adjusting tension and monitoring anchor points while lowering Murphy inch by careful inch toward the medical teams below. Halfway down the cliff face, the primary anchor point began to fail. Doss felt the tree stump shift slightly under load, sending vibrations through the rope that translated into sudden jerks on Murphy's stretcher. Below, medical teams scrambled to position safety nets and additional personnel, recognizing that the descent was becoming uncontrolled. "Easy, easy," Dr. Patterson called up from below, watching Murphy's stretcher swing closer to the rocky cliff face. "Bring him down slow." But slow was no longer an option. The anchor point was pulling loose from its foundation, requiring Doss to transfer load to the secondary lines while maintaining control of Murphy's descent. His hands, already raw and bleeding from previous rescues, left dark stains on the rope as he fought to prevent a catastrophic drop that would kill the lieutenant instantly. The rope held. Barely, with individual strands popping under stress, but it held long enough for Murphy to reach safety in the arms of waiting medics. As soon as the lieutenant was clear, the entire improvised system collapsed, sending the anchor point tumbling down the cliff face in a shower of coral fragments and splintered wood. Doss found himself stranded on a narrow ledge 30 feet above the medical teams, with no rope and no obvious route down the cliff face. Below, Murphy was being loaded onto a stretcher for transport to the rear aid station, alive but facing months of rehabilitation that might never restore full function to his legs. "Doss!" Crawford called from above. "You all right down there?" "Fine," he called back, though fine was relative when trapped on a cliff face with enemy mortars beginning to bracket the area. The Japanese had observed the rescue operation and adjusted their fire accordingly, sending rounds that struck closer to the medical teams with each salvo. The solution came from an unexpected source. Private Williams, despite his own injuries, had organized the medical teams into an impromptu rescue effort. Using medical equipment and communication wire, they rigged a new line that could reach Doss's position. The ascent required careful coordination between multiple teams, but within 20 minutes, Doss was back on solid ground. 17 men, Dr. Patterson reported as they moved Williams and Murphy toward the rear aid station. 17 men brought down from that ridge tonight, and every one of them alive when they reached us. But Doss wasn't ready to claim success. Voices still called from positions scattered across Hacksaw Ridge. Weaker now, some barely audible over the rain and distant gunfire, but unmistakably human. The rope system had failed completely, leaving him no means of reaching men who might survive until dawn if they received medical attention. The decision came down to basic mathematics. Attempt dangerous night rescues without proper equipment, risking additional casualties among the rescue teams, or wait for dawn and hope the remaining wounded could survive until a properly equipped relief effort could reach the ridge. Standard military doctrine favored the conservative approach: consolidate gains, minimize additional risks, evacuate known survivors while planning a daylight rescue for any remaining casualties. But doctrine hadn't spent the night listening to wounded men call for help from positions where dawn might come too late. As medical teams prepared to evacuate the 17 rescued men, Doss stood at the base of Hacksaw Ridge, looking up toward the darkness where voices still carried on the wind. The improvised rope lay in ruins around the cliff base, its fibers separated and anchor points destroyed. Above, rain continued to fall on positions where Americans and Japanese faced each other across a landscape that belonged to neither side. The night was ending, but the ridge still held its wounded. And somewhere in the darkness, other decisions were being made. By Japanese commanders planning their own dawn operations, by American officers calculating acceptable losses, and by one unarmed medic who couldn't shake the sound of voices calling from positions everyone else had abandoned. The secret Doss never told the reporters, never mentioned in interviews decades later, was how close he came to abandoning the ridge entirely. It happened during the third hour of the rescue operation, after lowering 8 men to safety and hearing at least 10 more calling from scattered positions across the plateau. His hands were bleeding, his improvised medical supplies exhausted, and Japanese mortar fire was adjusting closer to the rope anchor point with each salvo. The logical decision, the decision any rational person would make, was to descend the cliff and let properly equipped rescue teams handle the remaining casualties at dawn. He had actually started climbing down the rope when Private Morrison began screaming, not calling for help, not shouting medical instructions, but screaming in pure terror as enemy soldiers emerged from a tunnel entrance near his position. Morrison was too wounded to move, defenseless against Japanese troops who might kill him outright or take him prisoner for interrogation. His screams carried clearly across the ridge, growing more desperate as enemy voices responded in sharp Japanese commands. Doss stopped his descent and climbed back up the rope. That moment, hanging 30 feet above safety while choosing to return to a ridge where enemy soldiers were actively hunting American wounded, represented a decision that military manuals couldn't address. It wasn't heroism in any conventional sense, because heroes in stories don't spend precious seconds calculating odds and fighting their own survival instincts. It was simply the point where walking away became impossible. The Japanese patrol had emerged from positions much closer to the American lines than intelligence estimates suggested. 3 soldiers, moving systematically through shell craters and checking abandoned equipment, had discovered Morrison's position while conducting their own casualty assessment. They spoke quietly among themselves, examining Morrison's wounds and debating options that Doss couldn't understand but could easily imagine. Moving toward Morrison's position required crossing open ground where enemy soldiers could observe his approach. Doss had no weapon, no means of defending himself or Morrison if discovered, and no backup plan if the rescue attempt failed. The only advantages he possessed were darkness, rain that limited visibility, and the Japanese soldiers' apparent focus on their immediate surroundings rather than broader area security. The approach took 20 minutes of careful movement, crawling through mud and coral fragments while monitoring the enemy soldiers' conversation and movement patterns. They seemed disciplined but not particularly alert, treating the patrol as routine consolidation rather than active combat operations. Morrison had stopped screaming, whether from shock, unconsciousness, or deliberate effort to avoid attracting additional attention. When Doss reached Morrison's crater, he found the private conscious but barely responsive, his earlier terror replaced by resignation and exhaustion. "They were here," Morrison whispered. 3 of them. They looked at me and left. The Japanese soldiers had moved on without harming Morrison, apparently satisfied that he posed no threat and offered no intelligence value. Their departure created a narrow window for evacuation, but Morrison's position remained exposed to observation from multiple tunnel entrances where other enemy personnel might emerge. Getting Morrison back to the cliff edge required retracing the dangerous route across open ground, now complicated by the knowledge that Japanese patrols were operating throughout the American-held sections of the ridge. Every shadow might conceal enemy soldiers, every sound might trigger contact that would end the rescue operation permanently. The rope held Morrison's weight, but barely. Several strands had begun separating during previous rescues, and the anchor point showed stress fractures that deepened with each loading cycle. Lowering Morrison became an exercise in faith and physics, testing the limits of both human engineering and divine intervention that Doss relied upon equally. Below, medical teams received Morrison with the efficiency born of hours of practice, immediately checking vital signs and preparing him for evacuation to rear aid stations. Dr. Patterson noted Morrison's condition in his log: severe blood loss, possible internal injuries, exposure complications, prognosis uncertain but survivable with proper treatment. Due to what Patterson couldn't note in any official report was the look in Morrison's eyes, not gratitude, not relief, but a combination of wonder and terror that would stay with him for decades. Morrison had seen enemy soldiers close enough to touch, had prepared for death or capture, and had been saved by a man with no weapon who'd climbed back up a rope to reach him. As Doss prepared to ascend the rope again, Dr. Patterson caught his arm. "How many more?" he asked quietly. "Voices calling from at least 6 positions," Doss replied. "Maybe more. Hard to tell with the mortar fire." Patterson checked his watch. 0347 hours. Dawn was less than 2 hours away, bringing daylight that would make movement on the ridge suicidal, but might also bring reinforcement and proper evacuation equipment. "You've done enough," he said. "More than enough." But Doss was already climbing back up the rope, his bleeding hands gripping fibers that showed increasing wear with each use. Above him, voices continued calling through the rain and darkness, each one representing a decision between personal survival and impossible responsibility. The secret he never shared was how many times during that night he'd wanted to stop, wanted to climb down the rope and let someone else make the impossible choices. Heroes in stories don't face that temptation, don't spend long minutes hanging on fraying ropes while calculating the odds of their own survival. But the voices kept calling, and the rope kept holding, and somewhere between midnight and dawn on Hacksaw Ridge, one man's repeated choice to climb back up became the foundation of a legend that would outlast everyone who lived through that night. 50 years later, Doss would wake from dreams where he could still hear voices calling from Hacksaw Ridge, still feel the rough hemp fibers cutting into his palms, still smell the mixture of rain and smoke that hung over the plateau that night. But in 1945, as dawn approached on May 5th, he was focused on reaching 2 final wounded men before Japanese mortars made movement impossible. The rope finally snapped completely during the 18th rescue. Corporal Andrews plummeted 15 feet to the rocky ledge below, breaking his left arm, in addition to the shrapnel wounds that had left him stranded on the ridge. But he was alive, conscious, and being treated by medical teams who had learned to position safety equipment under every descent after watching the rope deteriorate throughout the night. Doss found himself stranded on Hacksaw Ridge with no means of descent, and one wounded soldier still calling from a position near the Japanese-controlled sector. Private First Class Chen had been unconscious for most of the night, but had begun calling weakly as shock and blood loss entered their final stages. Reaching him would require crossing ground that daylight would expose to enemy observation, while remaining on the ridge meant certain death when Japanese forces launched their anticipated dawn counterattack. The decision was made by elimination rather than choice. The improvised rope system had collapsed completely, the original anchor points were destroyed, and medical teams below had no equipment capable of reaching the cliff top. Chen's voice was growing weaker with each call, suggesting that he would die from his wounds long before rescue teams could mount a daylight operation. Doss began moving toward Chen's position just as the first mortar rounds of the Dawn barrage began falling on the ridge. The approach required crossing the most dangerous section of the plateau, where multiple Japanese observation points offered clear sightlines and overlapping fields of fire. Doss moved in short rushes between shell craters, timing his movement to coincide with mortar impacts that would distract enemy observers and mask the sound of his passage through coral fragments and mud. Chen was barely conscious when Doss reached him, his pulse weak and irregular, his breathing shallow and labored. Multiple shrapnel wounds had caused severe blood loss, while exposure during the long night had pushed his body temperature toward dangerous levels. Standard medical protocol would require immediate surgical intervention that was impossible to provide on the ridge. "Doss," Chen whispered when he recognized the medic's face. "You came back." Moving Chen to safety required improvising a solution that combined desperation with physics. Doss fashioned a crude stretcher from abandoned rifle stocks and torn shelter halves, then began dragging Chen toward a section of cliff face where collapsed coral had created a steep but possibly negotiable slope. The route was longer and more exposed than the rope descent, but it offered the only chance of reaching the bottom alive. The descent took 2 hours, with frequent stops to rest and adjust Chen's position on the improvised stretcher. Japanese observers had identified their movement and called in mortar fire that bracketed their route with increasing accuracy. Several rounds landed close enough to shower them with coral fragments, but the steep angle of the slope provided some protection from direct hits. Halfway down the cliff face, Chen lost consciousness completely, his body going limp against the stretcher restraints. Doss checked for pulse and breathing, finding both present but growing weaker as blood loss and shock progressed beyond the point where field medicine could provide meaningful intervention. Getting Chen to the aid station alive would require speed that the dangerous terrain couldn't accommodate. Medical teams waiting at the base of the cliff had observed the descent through binoculars, preparing equipment and personnel for what appeared to be the final rescue of the night. "Doctor." Patterson checked his watch. 0627 hours. Full daylight would arrive within 30 minutes, ending any possibility of additional rescue operations until evening. When Chen reached the bottom, his pulse was barely detectable, his breathing erratic and shallow. Patterson began emergency resuscitation procedures while orderlies prepared plasma and surgical equipment, knowing that Chen's survival depended on interventions that should have been provided hours earlier. 19, Patterson announced quietly as Chen's vital signs stabilized under treatment. 19 men brought down from that ridge. Doss collapsed beside the aid station, his hands too damaged to grip anything larger than a pencil, his uniform torn and soaked with rainwater and other men's blood. Around him, medical teams worked frantically to stabilize casualties whose survival had been purchased with a night's worth of impossible decisions and equipment failure that had somehow become equipment success. The after-action reports would note the successful evacuation of wounded personnel from Hacksaw Ridge under challenging conditions. The language would be clinical, precise, focused on tactical results rather than human costs. The Congressional Medal of Honor citation would mention courage and devotion to duty, using phrases that compressed hours of terror and exhaustion into sentences suitable for public consumption. But the rope, cut into sections and distributed among medical teams as souvenirs, carried different memories. Each piece of frayed hemp held the weight of decisions made in darkness, of voices calling from positions where dawn might come too late, of one man's repeated choice to climb back up when every rational calculation suggested climbing down. Chen survived his wounds, but never regained full use of his left leg. Morrison recovered completely, returning to civilian life where he worked as a telephone repairman and never spoke about the night he spent on Hacksaw Ridge. Murphy's spinal injuries healed partially, leaving him with limited mobility, but full sensation in his legs. Doss returned to civilian life carrying memories that never fully faded, the sound of hemp fibers popping under stress, the weight of unconscious men being lowered through darkness, the voices that called from scattered positions across a ridge that belonged to no one and everyone. He married, raised children, worked as a carpenter, and attended church services where he occasionally spoke about faith and service, but never about the specific texture of rope cutting into bleeding palms. The ridge itself was secured 3 days later by a coordinated assault that benefited from improved intelligence and properly positioned support weapons. The cave systems that had made Japanese defense so effective were neutralized with explosives and flamethrowers, clearing the plateau for American forces advancing toward the southern end of Okinawa. In 1995, 50 years after the night on Hacksaw Ridge, Doss received a letter from Chen's daughter thanking him for giving her father the chance to walk her down the aisle at her wedding. The letter mentioned that Chen still carried a piece of rope in his wallet, a frayed section he'd kept since the war ended, though he'd never explained to his family why it was important. Doss read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his Bible next to a photograph of 19 young men whose names he'd memorized, but whose faces had begun to fade with time. Outside, rain was falling on the roof of his house, creating the same sound pattern that had accompanied his movements across Hacksaw Ridge decades earlier. The rope was gone, but the voices remained. They would always remain, calling from positions where courage and faith had intersected with physics and human endurance, creating moments that official reports could document but never fully explain. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.